Joined now by Sean Callahan of Husker Online. We're talking win totals this week because our friends at FanDuel dropped a lot of win totals on us. And speaking of a lot of wins, the folks at FanDuel predicting more wins for Nebraska than we've seen in a mighty long time, Sean. The number is 7.5.
Yeah, I'll be honest, Andy. I was a little just surprised how hot it came out of the gates. I thought, hey, they'll tread. I mean, get it 6.5. But when you take a couple steps back, look at the schedule, look at their first 7 games, look at the Power 5 opponents. Yes, Colorado is in Lincoln, but it's Rutgers in Lincoln. It's Illinois in Lincoln. It's Purdue and Indiana on the road. Year one coach in Indiana. Purdue was arguably one of the worst teams. They lost a lot of players that were good off that team a year ago. So it's about as manageable of an opening 7 games as you're going to have. And if you have a freshman quarterback like Dylan Raiola, it's a heck of a lot better than having to open back-to-back weeks on national televised games at Minnesota and at Colorado like Jeff Sims had to do this past year.
Yeah, and you think about that, really one fewer turnover in the Minnesota game. We're looking at Nebraska's season entirely differently because it does end in a bowl game probably. And, they're coming with a little more momentum. But this does look like it sets up nicely for the first bowl trip for the Cornhuskers in a long time. You mentioned Dylan Raiola, and I think that's another very interesting piece of this because the way that quarterback recruiting shook out and the way that depth chart shook out, Kyle McCord took a visit, but then wound up deciding to go to Syracuse. This is Dylan Raiola's show, it feels like.
Yeah, he's got to come in the spring. There's 3 scholarship quarterbacks. Hunter Carberg, who was the primary starter a year ago, is back, but he got hurt and obviously down the stretch struggled once his body got banged around. And then Daniel Kalen, another Elite 11 freshman, will be here, but it's all set up for Raiola. I mean, if he comes in and does what everyone thinks he can do, it's hard not to see him as the starter. The arm talent, they just haven't had that in this program in a really long time.
Well, and I'm curious because the Colorado game is a great litmus test, I feel like, because they played them in week 2 last year. That was the turnovers again got out of control at the end of the first half, and then the game just completely got away from them. It feels like it'll be a good way to see how far the rest of this team has come under Matt Rhule. Obviously, if it's Raiola, the starter, he's new, but everybody else who's been there, what do they look like? Tony White's defense is back. Are they still as good as they were?
Yeah, Tony White's defense is going to be really good next year. There's a reason why Nebraska had no NFL Combine invites because all their guys that are good have come back for the most part. Nash Hutmacher, Ty Robinson, Jamari Butler, all come back on the front. And then Princewell Umanyelin and some really talented guys on the next level, pass rushers, MJ Sherman. You go down the line, and then they return, 5 of their 6 top DBs, led by Tommy Hill, who led the Big Ten in pass breakups. He's back. Isaac Gifford returns. So it's a really, really good back. So that Colorado game, when you just kind of start to look ahead, they're a really good matchup because the secondary is going to be good. And that stadium will be a hornet's nest for Deion Sanders to come in here because that game just didn't sit well in the state. People obviously did not like to see Nebraska lose in that type of manner to Colorado. And you got to believe that will be big noon kickoff on Fox, 2:30 CBS or NBC. That will be a big stage for that game when Deion Sanders comes to Lincoln.
And Colorado will just finish tangling in its season opener with North Dakota State, which is not really an easy out. Like that's not a guaranteed win either there. So that's going to be very intriguing. Nebraska starts with UTEP, so that's you're breaking that in. Northern Iowa, Illinois opening Big Ten play September 21st in Lincoln. Like you said, it's not Illinois is not a way to ease in because Brett Bielema's team will punch you in the mouth. But it's another good kind of test of here's where Nebraska is relative to where it was.
Yeah, I think the best way to phrase it is the first 7 games, they will not play a team that recruits higher level players than they do. Like there is no Ohio State, there is no Michigan or Oregon, USC, where that they have higher ranked recruiting classes than you most years. Nebraska recruits higher ranked classes than all of those first 7 opponents. When you break that down, now do they develop and build a program? I mean, that's that's where Matt Rhule has to kind of take that big year 2 step forward that he's been known for. And you mentioned that opener against UTEP, Andy. This is the first time since 2019 that Nebraska will open the season at home. It's the first time since 2019 they'll open the season against a non-Power 5 team.
Really? Man, I didn't even. But you're right; they have been on the road, or like last year was
Ireland.
yeah, they went into Ireland to play Northwestern. Last year was a Thursday night. Here's the first Big Ten game of the year situation. Yeah, this is a much more gradual easing into the schedule. Now it closes in a nasty, nasty way with Ohio State, UCLA, at USC, Wisconsin, and at Iowa. But when you kind of break that down, obviously Ohio State's going to be brutal. But they're going to be brutal for everybody. But we don't know what UCLA is going to be. They just hired Deshaun Foster. Actually, question: how worried were folks in Nebraska about Tony White, the defensive coordinator, getting plucked by his alma mater as the head coach?
Well, I think people are naturally worried because it is a good fit for Tony White, and obviously, if they came with him with an offer, I think it'd be hard to turn it down. He's from UCLA. He played there. He has been on the radar for jobs. I mean, people believe that he turned down Lincoln Riley to be his D coordinator. He kind of pulled back from the San Diego State job opening when that was there. He was in play for that position. So his name, all the jobs that you would think Tony White might leave Nebraska for, they kind of all open this year: San Diego State, USC, UCLA. But I think Tony knows, he's making $1.6 million. He's one of the highest paid assistant coaches now in the Big Ten Conference, I believe top 2 or 3 now. So he's well paid. And I think another good year with this defense, kind of sustaining what they did in year 1. He's going to be up for some more jobs. I mean, he'll be a head coach. It's a matter of just kind of when that process happens.
So it's possible that Nebraska can split the LA teams. We actually don't know what USC is going to be. I mean, I'm curious. I mentioned this on the show yesterday. Does Lincoln Riley have the benefit of the doubt anymore? Because we came into last season going, they just got to get the defense a little bit better. They got Caleb Williams back. Now they don't bring Caleb Williams back. It's Miller Moss, or it might be the transfer from Nevada, but we don't know what that's going to look like. D'Anton Lynn, we think, is going to improve their defense, but again, believe it when we see it. Like it other than Ohio State, I don't see a guaranteed loss on this schedule, which is wild considering Nebraska hasn't been to a bowl game since when?
2016.
Wow.
I mean, I think Iowa, if they were still doing West and East divisions, I think Iowa would be the heavy favorite to win a West division again. I mean, I do think the Hawkeyes return a lot, with McNamara and some of the key guys coming back on their team. So
but Nebraska's played them so well lately. That's the thing. I can't automatically plug in Iowa as beating Nebraska.
And I love the LA stretch for Nebraska because you get UCLA in Lincoln in deep November. Mm-hmm. So I kind of say that's advantage traditional Big Ten team when you bring a team like that into possibly cold conditions. Then Nebraska goes out to LA for USC, and their offense won't be limited. When you play a November 15th game in the Big Ten, you might have to cut your playbook down to nothing because of the winds and the cold. Well, Nebraska gets to go out to LA, play USC. You get the full version of Dylan Raiola in that game, where we've seen games in late November in this league where you have to really scale down what you do because of the cold and the wind conditions that time of year.
Yeah, it is amazing to think about that and how UCLA and USC have to adjust. I don't know that Washington and Oregon have to adjust as much because they get pretty cold there as well. But it's funny because they go to LA and then a week later they're back against Wisconsin in a game that both teams should feel very comfortable in.
Right. Yeah. And you never, sometimes it can be 60 degrees that time of year. Other times it can be below 20 with 30-mile-an-hour winds out of the north. And when that's happening in the stadium, it really changes special teams. It changes how you throw the ball down the field and what you do. And you better be able to run the ball and you better be able to stop the run. And I think Nebraska's built to do those things right now. They return a great offensive line group, a very good defensive front, and they're deep at running back. So they are built for those kinds of games. But I love the fact that when they go to USC, Dylan Raiola more than likely will have a nice 70-degree night in LA to play, which doesn't always happen in late November in the Big Ten Conference.
It does now, baby. It does now. Well, and like Wisconsin's an interesting one because that's one we don't know what they're going to be. We saw the first taste of the Luke Fickell team last year with that offense that Phil Longo runs. I am of the opinion that if Wisconsin does develop some team speed on the outside, that they're going to be a pretty tough offense to stop. But Nebraska is actually kind of defense that's built to stop an offense like that.
Yeah, their defense matched up. I mean, the mobility last year of Wisconsin's quarterback is what hurt them. I mean, they played well enough to win that game in Madison. The way they jumped up with Chuba Purdy's quick start, and it was they had a chance to win it in regulation. They lost it in overtimes. So that one, yeah, just like the Iowa game. I mean, Nebraska has been right there with Wisconsin. I think if the Badgers make a jump, it's going to be on defense. I mean, look at what they did in the portal. You can argue that they brought in by far the best linebacker group in the portal with 3 highly rated guys joining that roster. So that's probably been the most impressive thing from afar is watching what they've been able to do in the portal as he's upgraded that roster there in Madison.
Well, and I just think this is going to be a fascinating year for all of these former Big Ten West teams because we've talked about it with Wisconsin. Like clearly they are trying to not be a Big Ten West quote unquote team anymore. They want to be able to compete with the Ohio States and the Penn States and the Oregons. Nebraska doesn't seem like that. I mean, Rhule's been in the Big 12. He designed a team at Baylor to compete in the Big 12. He designed a team at Temple to compete in the American. He seems to kind of figure out what the lay of the land looks like. But I am fascinated to see what Iowa and Illinois and Minnesota, and I know Nebraska doesn't have Minnesota this year, but what do those teams look like? Because their personality was built for the West, and the West doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, if you don't kind of advance your thinking here, you are going to be trapped in this kind of 6 to 7 win purgatory in the Big Ten, where it's going to be hard to advance out of that level. To get up to that next tier 8, 9, 10 win type program, you're going to have to beat some really good teams. You're going to have to beat teams that recruit at a high level, develop at a high level, have great coaches. And, the Big Ten West kind of allowed you to maybe bump yourself up to a 9-win type season, maybe a 10-win season. Those type of years aren't going to be easy to come by now in this 18-team conference. And we were talking off air, it might be 20 by the summer. You never know if Florida State, North Carolina, and some of these ACC teams join the league down the road. It's going to be hard to get to a 9-win type team in this new conference.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to recruit differently. You've got to think differently. And I think that's where Rhule coming in when he did probably helps because he had 1 year of the Big Ten West, but not enough to kind of color his judgment about what the program has to look like. He probably came in with the idea of, I got to get it ready for what's coming.
And then you think about the injuries he battled with quarterbacks and running backs, and all of his top receivers were down. I mean, he lost his top running backs, his top receivers, and the transfer quarterback they went all in on ended up being a bust. So his year one, just to even get 5 wins, and they should have made a bowl. That's the disappointing thing. They could have probably won 7 or 8 games. And I think that's what upsets a lot of Husker fans, how close they were to getting back to a bowl. But if that would have played out, maybe they don't get Dylan Raiola. I think the way the quarterback spot reopened itself back up because Chuba Purdy, Jeff Sims, Heinrich Haarberg really never grasped it, that probably played as big of a factor of getting Dylan Raiola. So you can argue that the way things ended probably played a huge factor to get Raiola to Lincoln.
Yeah, it definitely feels like early playing time was very important to Raiola because if you look at the timing of the flip from Georgia, coincides pretty closely with when Carson Beck made a definitive decision to come back, where obviously that job was not going to be open this year. So, this is, like you said, Raiola's show. What's it been like for him in Lincoln early on? Is he as big of a rock star as you would imagine?
Yeah, I mean, he's everywhere. I mean, he's already probably having to go into back doors and wear hats around town because, I mean, he's more recognizable than anybody in this town. And I mean, I was coaching a first grade girls basketball game in one of those giant multi-gym complexes, and he rolled in and, took a bunch of pictures with a group of second grade boys and autographs. And, you see him sitting courtside at basketball games next to the athletic director of Trev Alberts. I mean, it's been wild just to think the first month what it's been like for him here. And obviously we don't know the terms, but we know he's got a significant NIL agreement with the 1890 collective and other things in place. So He's unlike any other student athlete that's probably come on this campus in a long, long time, especially in the NIL era.
Reminds me a little bit of when I was covering Florida and Tim Tebow was a freshman, and my wife and I are in Best Buy, and so he's played the majority of his freshman season at that point. So it's between the regular season and the bowl game. And my wife and I are in Best Buy, and as we're walking out, we see Tim and his older brother walking in. And I just kind of pointed out to her. I was like, "Hey, that's Tim Tebow." And she's like, "Oh, that's interesting." And so we walk out, and I ran into the wife of one of the assistant coaches a couple of days later, and I said, "Yeah, we saw Tim at Best Buy the other day." And she goes, "You know, they had to call the cops to get him out of there, right?" I was like, "That," but that's what happens in some of these campuses when you have that highly touted kind of savior of the program quarterback.
Well, and he was identified as a freshman in high school, and that helps add to the marketing of a guy like Raiola. When fan bases learn your name when they're that young and follow you through, and there's obviously been a lot of drama with how his recruiting process played out. I don't know if there's ever been a more recognizable recruit come to campus in Nebraska in a long, long time.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. And it's interesting because it feels like that defense will take some pressure off him. We keep talking about him, but somebody like Nash Hutmacher will be the one who kind of helps him along because he won't have to score as many points.
Well, and remember, Rhule wants to run the ball. He wants to play with tight ends and a fullback. I mean, he uses that San Francisco 49ers model as the style he wants to play on. I mean, that's how they want to build their team, with interchangeable parts, guys that can come in and play tight end, fullback, receiver, running backs. And he believes like that's their way that they can build a winning roster. So yeah, Raiola is going to be a huge part of it if he wins the job and everything goes fine, but they want to have a lot around him too.
Yeah, and we know that Rhule, like, he has this fullback camp to go find his Kyle Juszczyk. The question is, can you get your Christian McCaffrey and your Deebo Samuel? That's the tricky part.
Yeah, I know, you're right. The fullback camp's back, by the way, and
all right,
and
yes.
the postgraduate camp, and they found like 2 players from that camp. James Williams, who had some sacks in games this year, came from like the postgraduate just show up and try out camp.
Wow, it's amazing, and it's a little old school flavor from Nebraska. The program that had the best walk-on program in the country. Like they seem to. That's the interesting is Rhule does seem to have embraced the things that Nebraskans love about their program, but he's also trying to build it for the new Big Ten.
Well, and they can also pay walk-ons now. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, the collective has been huge. I mean, there's probably 3 or 4 guys they signed as walk-ons that would have been scholarship level guy any other year, but because of the flexibility of NIL, they can get these guys in as walk-ons, and then they can enter some NIL agreements.
It is a brave new world of college football, Sean Callahan, and it might be a world where Nebraska can go over 9.5. 9.5. I'm mixing Nebraska and Miami up there. Miami is actually 9.5. Nebraska might be able to go over 7.5, which I think they'll take over 9.5. But I think they'll also take over 7.5 right now.
People would take 6 in a trip to Detroit right now. I mean, just get to a bowl game. I mean, that's the first step this program needs to get back to kind of build what they want to be.
Well, Eminem has a restaurant at Ford Field called Mom's Spaghetti. So if they were to make it there you go. Although you go over 7.5, the bowl destination probably gets a little warmer.
Steve Sipple's in the background. He just got excited about that Detroit report. So
that's the way to do it. Like I said, get excited about Detroit, and if you wind up in Tampa, that's just all gravy.
All right. I'm looking forward. It should be a fun year, and spring ball doesn't start until the end of March, so we've kind of got about 6 weeks of just dog days before spring ball.
That's just more time to get excited about Dylan Raiola. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.